Friends, hello there. Hey, welcome to part 2 of our series on the Sabbath. If you had a chance to watch or to listen to last week's episode, you will know we didn't talk much about the Sabbath at all. In fact, we talked about a theology of work. And if you haven't had a chance to watch or listen to that, I would highly recommend you doing that. Mark Buchanan once wrote, he says, if you don't have a rich theology of labor, you will have an impoverished view of rest. And so we tackled that rich theology last week so that we can have a really good understanding of the significance of rest reflected in this thing called the Sabbath. And so I want to begin our time today by looking at Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. This is among the 10 commandments God gives this to Israel at Mount Sinai. And when we come to verse 8 in chapter 20, we have this. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. All right, 5 quick observations I want to make about the Sabbath commandment here in Exodus chapter 20. And the first is this. It's one of the 10 commandments. You know, God gives Israel 613 commandments, and this is among the big 10. And in essence, the 10 in many ways represent all of the commandments, which makes this even more astounding that Sabbath would show up here. You know, we read the other ones. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not commit adultery. And we look at those and we go, okay, yeah, those make sense. I'll abstain from that. And then we hear the word Sabbath and we go, optional. Like, it just doesn't compute. Like, why would this be part of the big 10? Observation 2, it's the 4th commandment. You go, well, why is that significant? Well, it has to do with the fact that the first 3 commandments are about how we relate to God, and the last 6 commandments are how we relate to one another. And Sabbath is this linchpin commandment where it ties together both an understanding about how we relate to God as well as how we relate to one another. It's like the commandment that ties in the idea about how you love God and love others well. A third observation is this. It's framed in the positive, right? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Only, honor your father and your mother is the other commandment of the 10 that is framed in a positive manner. The 4th observation is this. It's the longest of the 10 commandments. It's almost as if God goes, I need to put a lot of words in this so that my people will understand why they're supposed to obey it. And then connected to that, the 5th observation, it's the only one of the 10 commandments to reference an event. It's like God throws in this connection to a story that would bring greater depth and understanding to his people for why they were supposed to observe Sabbath in the first place. So there you go. There's just 5 quick observations around the significance of the Sabbath. Now, when we read the word Sabbath here in Exodus chapter 20, one of the questions that comes to mind for me is this question. Where does the word Sabbath first show up in the Bible? Now, I would imagine many of us immediately jumped to Genesis. Genesis chapter 2, the 7th day. God even references it here in Exodus chapter 20. And the irony in all of this is, yes, it is a Sabbath day God takes, but it's actually never designated with the word Sabbath in the book of Genesis. And we're going to come back to what's going on in Genesis 1 and 2 in the coming weeks. But what I want to do is run this trail of where this word Sabbath first shows up, because there is something called the principle of first use. And the idea is that when you come to a key word in the Bible, one of the questions you want to ask is, where does this word first show up? Because when you go there, the larger context of where that word shows up often provides a depth of understanding and meaning around the word. And where I show you this where this first shows up, I believe does this for helping us to understand something really significant about Sabbath that God wants us to understand from His Word. And so it doesn't show up first in Exodus 20, by the way. It's 4 chapters earlier in Exodus chapter 16. This is where Sabbath, by name, the term Sabbath, is first used. And so let me give you the larger context of Exodus 16. God has just rescued and redeemed Israel from their slavery in Egypt. He has brought them out into the desert of Sinai. He just provided them water because they were in need of water. And now they're in need of food. And God is going to provide food to them in the form of quail and in the form of something called manna. So in the morning, there'd be like this dew on the ground, and there's a substance there that is called manna, and it's like this bread-like substance. And through Moses, God says to the people, for the first 5 days, I want you to collect enough manna in the morning for that day. If you try to collect more than what you need for that day, when you wake up in the morning, it's going to have maggots in it. It's going to spoil. It's going to rot. And then God says, but on the 6th day, I want you to collect twice the amount, because that will be for the 6th day and the 7th day. Because when you wake up in the morning on the 7th day, 2 realities. One, there will be no manna on the ground for you to collect. And 2, the manna that you got on the 6th day will be preserved, i.e., it's not going to spoil, it's not going to have maggots in it. And so God says that He's doing this to see if Israel will obey Him in this. Now, with respect to what's going on during those first 5 days, we then read this in Exodus chapter 16, beginning in verse 20. However, some of them paid no attention to Moses, and they kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. And then we're told that Moses was not happy with them for doing that. And then we read this in verse 21. Each morning everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. And then Moses said to them, this is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest. First time the word Sabbath shows up right here in verse 23. A holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning. So they saved it until morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. And then Moses will go on from there and talk about how, they're supposed to observe the Sabbath day. So when God gives the word Sabbath for the first time in Scripture, He does so in this context of Exodus 16. And the word Sabbath, by the way, in Hebrew is the word Shabbat. And one of the things that we do with the language of Hebrew is that we understand that it is a verbal-based language, meaning all nouns and adjectives are derived from verbs. And so if you know Hebrew or you know how to use the language of Hebrew, then one of the questions we ask is, what is the verb that the noun is coming from? Because it gives us, again, a better understanding of the word itself. And so the word Shabbat comes from the Hebrew verb shavat, which means to cease. And so Sabbath means a day of ceasing. And the reason why I draw this out is because for many of us, we think of Sabbath as a day of rest. And the importance of understanding this as a day of ceasing is just the intentionality we have to cease from doing something in order to enter in to a kind of rest. We have to be intentional to cease in order to experience a sense of rest. And so when God gives this to Israel, this idea of ceasing, I would just say this, that Israel, they were to cease and to trust that God would provide for them. That the heart here that I want to get at, or an issue of Sabbath, is this idea of trust. that God said to them, like, I need you to trust me. That the food that you collect on the sixth day isn't going to spoil. That even though there isn't going to be any food produced on the seventh day, you are going to be provided for with which I gave you to collect on the sixth day. That God is testing them with their obedience. Are they going to obey Him? Are they going to trust Him that God will provide for their needs if they pull themselves out of the mix one day out of the week? It is so amazing what God is trying to do with them, because I believe for God it's an issue of trust. And Sabbath posits this question to us. It's this question, in whom do you trust? God's saying, do you trust yourself? Like you're going to provide for your basic needs, you're going to hold the world together, or are you going to trust me? And so God begins introducing this idea with the gathering of manna, and then 4 chapters later when they come to Mount Sinai and God gives them the 10 commandments, in the midst of this, God then takes this idea and He continues it on to this idea of doing work. And so when we start to think about like work and we start thinking about like how we trust God, like I think there are a number of issues of Sabbath, and it's why it becomes such an important issue for God. But let me just show you how significant Sabbath is for God. In Exodus 31 verses 14 to 15, 3 times we have this emphasis on either being put to death or being cut off if anybody breaks Sabbath. You know, God says if you desecrate the Sabbath, like that person needs to be put to death. They're going to be cut off from their people. Like if you do any work on the Sabbath day, you will be put to death. And so this idea, again, around work being dignified and good and wonderful is significant for us to keep in mind, because when God is asking us to take a break, He's not diminishing the idea of work. He's making sure that we understand it appropriately with respect to our relationship to God. That how we do our work and how we conduct our work is connected to our relationship with God. That's what we talked about in the last episode. And so what God is asking us to do is, are we going to trust Him with the work that we do, and to understand that if we take a break and we cease for a day out of the week, that the world isn't going to implode. And by the way, the Bible never really defines work. Like a couple places in the Hebrew Scriptures, it talks about, what constitutes work. But by and large, friends, I believe for you and I, we have to get our own understanding about what work is. And so I've been kind of ruminating on this definition that I think will be helpful for us to circle back to throughout the series. And it's just this, that work is that which governs your life the other 6 days of the week, or maybe even 5 days. For some of you, it is your job. Like if you have a job, your work is in many ways, that is your job. If you're a student, like your schoolwork, that's work. If you're a stay-at-home mom or dad, like there are lots of things that you are doing, not just taking care of your kids, but probably, you're doing laundry and dishes and cooking and cleaning and all that stuff that just kind of gets bundled into who you are. That like, this is how I want us to think in terms of work, that all of us have work. There's all of us have things that governs our life. And so as we continue this conversation, in this episode and the weeks to come, just think about terms of, what is that thing that takes your time and attention throughout your week, and where God is saying to you, like, in whom do you trust if you're going to take a break? Like if you're going to struggle to take a break, it's probably because you believe like your world depends on you. Like what you need to produce, the money you need to make in order to get things done. That in many ways, Sabbath confronts us just with this idea of, are you willing to trust God with this? Or are you just going to continue to trust yourself? And when I first started celebrating Sabbath, I had just started seminary, and I had gone to my mentor at the time and just said, hey, what's your advice for me about, if I'm going through seminary? He said, two things. He gave me one about, how to become a competent and effective teacher. And the other thing he said is make sure you take Sabbath. And so I would remember, like, part of the whole idea of trust for me was I didn't do my work on Saturday. Now, the reason why Sunday wasn't our day of Sabbath, when I was going through seminary, is because I was often teaching places on Sunday. And so Sunday was a day of work for me. But I had to trust that the work that I did the rest of the week would be enough. And that, especially when I had exams on Monday, I wouldn't do anything on Saturday. And I would start looking at my stuff, Sunday afternoon or, whatever. And that was a day of work for me, if you will. And I had to trust that God was going to provide for me. And for more than a decade, I served as a teaching pastor. And, the majority of that time, I just spoke on Sundays. Like I know some of you who may be watching this, like you have to teach on Saturday as well as Sundays when you're up for that weekend, if you're a pastor, or maybe some other day of the week. And I had that luxury where, I only had to teach on Sundays. And so, for me, our Sabbath was again Saturday. And I just would get done with my work on Friday night going, God, I trust you, or I need to trust you, or help me to trust you, that when I get up early Sunday morning and look over my notes again, I'll be ready to go. Because when I teach, I don't teach with notes. They mess me up. And so, I'm always just kind of really working with content, from a memory perspective. And so I had to learn to trust God. And even, today in walking the text and the other work that I get to do, like there's a lot that needs to be done. And I'm continually trying to have a right relationship, with how much work I'm saying yes to, that I'm saying yes to the right work so that I just don't feel this overwhelming sense of stress permeating my life. But I know that when I take a day off and I take the Sabbath when I'm able to, and I'll be honest with you, I can't do that every week. That there are times when I'm asked to speak, and I speak on Saturday and Sunday. I do these weekend things, and I have to find, a break, during the week. And oftentimes, my family and I aren't able to celebrate Sabbath collectively because of, some of the work that God has called me to do. But as much as we can, we fight for time and we hold on to that Sabbath because in part it is an issue of trust. And so, one of the things that I find so fascinating is it's not just in Exodus 16 where you see this idea of trust, that even in Exodus 34:21, again through Moses, God says, 6 days you shall labor, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even during the plowing season and harvest, you must rest. If you're a farmer, these are the two most significant times of the year. And God goes, yep, even during the highest demands, I want you to take a break and I need you to trust me. And that ultimately, friends, we aren't going to trust God if we think we're at the center of our own universe. If we think we're the ones that manufacture, our world and our wealth and hold everything together, we're not going to do it. But I believe that what God is doing is he's saying, I need you to trust me. I need you to trust that I have it all together. And that for maybe some of us, when we start looking at it and we go, no, but if I take a day off, like I'm not going to be able to provide financially for my family, God goes, will you trust me that if you are obedient with what I'm asking you to do, you will have what you need? Some of you may go, yeah, but if I don't work, like I'm not going to get that promotion. And maybe God's going, well, maybe your life is already a little bit too extravagant as it is. That maybe you're trying to keep up with a lifestyle and you need to downsize. Maybe for some of you who are thinking about this in terms of school and you're like, yeah, but if I don't study, like I'm not going to get the grades to get into this grad school. And maybe God's going, has that grad school become an idol for you? That maybe that's not the school you're supposed to be in. Or God goes, yeah, that is the school you're supposed to be in. Will you trust me that if you are diligent with your time the other 6 days during the week and you take a break and you experience a Sabbath with me, I will be taking care of you. You will get into the right school. All will work out. Ultimately, friends, it falls back on, do we trust that God actually has everything together? Do we trust God's sovereignty? And I love what Mark Buchanan writes again in the Sabbath or in the rest of God, he says this, he says, unless we trust God's sovereignty, we won't dare risk Sabbath. And then he just goes on and he says this, and I love this. He says, there's no rest for those who don't believe that, i.e. in God's sovereignty. If God works all things together for good for those who love him and are called to his purposes, you can relax. If he doesn't, start worrying. Ah, I love that. Because friends, Sabbath does confront us with this question, in whom do you trust? How do you need to trust God anew in what he is asking you to do? So friends, there you go. We are launching headlong into this idea of Sabbath. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Again, there'll be additional questions at Walking the Text will help you go deeper with asking some of these questions. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And may you walk out the text well in your life.